to Dubai, just to get away. That's another principle about escaping regulation we'll come back to. War has been great for technical innovation. It's also been great for factories. In World War II, the U.S. government built scores of factories around the country, and then at the end of it, 4 industries had industry operate them, and then at the end of the war sold it to these companies for a song. No wonder U.S. industry was doing so well. Got this huge freebie from the government, which of course they immediately rejected because they were anti-socialist. No, they didn't do that, did they? They actually took the factories, and so you had like aluminum companies like, what is that big one? I don't remember. Alcoa. And so getting big factories, aluminum factories, Ford got factories, Kaiser got steel mill down in Southern California, and so on and so on. But then innovation, really good. War or semi-war, the Army, I've already said this, the Napoleonic Army was great for innovation. They invented canned goods and interchangeable parts. It was the U.S. military depot in Massachusetts, the armory there that actually perfects interchangeable parts. When I went young in the 60s and I was in the Army, my gun said, my M16 said, made by General Motors. That was a surprise. But technical innovation, the M16 would be a good example. That and the AK-47, inventing a better weapon to actually blow people's guts out. Those are very bad rifles. They don't actually shoot accurately. The ones from World War I are better. But what they do is put a really neat little hole through you. And then they invented this one with a tumbling .22 bullet that would rip the shit out of you. And that's much better in guerrilla jungle warfare. Or they make missiles, or the ENIAC, the first computers, well, all computing up through about 1970 was supported by the government, and so on. It's still a big buyer out of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley doesn't just make beautiful phones. And so on. And I think this is actually off a Defense Department website showing how techy they are about 20 years ago. And then, of course, war destroys a lot, and Schumpeter had this idea of creative destruction, that crises would destroy a lot of capital, out of which you would get new, fresh innovation and investment and so on, which was everybody loved Schumpeter's idea, but war is one of the greatest ways to get uncreative, creative destruction. And one of the reasons that Japan, Germany, Korea rebuilt in such efficient, competitive fashion is they'd blown out everything, and they built it all anew with the best technology. And they got a lot of labor mobilization after the wars, too, because there was kind of a national campaign to rebuild the country. Naturally enough, people wanted to rebuild their countries. So they went to work, and they weren't too fussy about wages and so on. And lo and behold, boom. If you can get people to work really hard at really low or reasonable wages, that's where all surplus comes from. Hegemony and blocks. The problem is in this international system is that it's not self-regulating. Now, there are attempts to argue along the market theory, liberal market theory, sort of liberal equivalent in international relations, which you can learn about in poli-sci courses, is a kind of equilibrium, balance of power, the balance of power theory. But in fact, there's rarely a stable balance of power, and we've had very violent wars in the 20th century. They were terrible wars because of the imbalance of power and the breakdown of the system. So it turns out it's very useful to have a dominant power that kind of is the biggest economy and the biggest military and can kind of keep things under control. And the two great examples of that are certainly Britain in the 19th century and the U.S. in the 20th. Not absolute imperial power, not an empire like the Roman Empire, or a tributary empire like the classic Chinese dynasties, but first among, maybe not equals, but a first among independent states, overseeing them, providing a military umbrella, providing institutions to try and calm tensions before they blow up. So the U.S., Britain, first among the powerful, not absolute but strong, maintain order, contain rivalries, and protect small states from the big ones, from predator states, and suppress revolts. Keep colony. For a long time it was keeping colonies under control or stopping revolutions. And now here are two cartoons that are two opposite, opposing view of here's the U.S. trying to keep a balance on the world, doing good for the world. We are helpful, and there are many instances where you could argue we played this role. Okay, so it's not just, so blood, and there are plenty of political cartoons I could have chosen with the U.S., blood sucking from the globe and so on, But there are those moments, and I kind of like this one of Uncle Sam whipping these people to drag NAFTA and the WTO and McDonald's forward. Also pretty polemical, right? But those are two diametrically opposite views of hegemony. Well, I'll give you my view of what the U.S. has done in a sec. Okay, Pax Britannica in the 19th century, Britain was industrial dominant, the commercial dominant, the naval dominant, and therefore it oversaw the system. It oversaw a long period of European or transatlantic growth in which Europe industrialized, North America industrialized, and very crucially, they defeated Napoleon and they stopped the French Revolution from spreading. It had already spread quite a bit. A lot of the European states took on Napoleonic codes and so on, but defeating Napoleon was very important in keeping the whole thing under control. And then there's, what do they call it? The peace. Never mind. Treaty of Vienna, I think, to try and contain the European states. And so Eurocapitalism was really consolidated in this period. And the Atlantic economy, meanwhile, the U.S. and parts of the Americas, especially Argentina, are growing lickety-split. International trade reached its highest in 1910 at a level it would not reach again until 1980s. And Britain provided the world's money, sterling, and imposed the gold standard through the 19th century. By the 20th century, this is a bad idea, but in the 19th century, it worked pretty well. And they were massive exporters of capital, actually. Compared to the U.S. the only country that probably comes anywhere close today would be maybe Norway, in terms of its aid. The UK exported unbelievable amounts of capital to the rest of the world for railroad development, mostly. Well, what happens is as Britain gets challenged by Germany and the U.S., France is coming on stronger and so on. By the end of the 19th century, you've got much more equivalence of power, colonial rivalries. They're all rubbing against each other. Germany is all talking about land and expansion to the east and yada, yada, yada. And they end up in World War I, which was a stalemate, basically. They fought each other to a draw. But the Treaty of Versailles was a disaster. It was very punitive on Germany. It led to disastrous political consequences in Germany, which was the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. Also, the collapse of as I told you once before, the end of World War I, you got the collapse of Russia, the Russian Tsar, and the revolution there. And so the interwar period is an extremely fraught period, and trade collapses, as I told you, and the global economy goes to hell without that old British hegemony. And World War II is even worse. World War I killed 20 million people. World War II kills 60 million. So when we talk about the Holocaust, we should remember it's a total Holocaust in Europe. It's just unbelievable what they did to themselves. And that's the end of the European system that had ruled for 500 years. Okay, now the other thing you can do to try and stabilize the system, particularly as the British system collapsed, we had colonization as a kind of direct economic domination and expansion. And the U.S. had already pioneered a slightly different kind of dominance with the Monroe Doctrine and just claiming that Latin America was our backyard, we should dominate trade, but we wouldn't actually colonize it. And that became a very common solution after the breakup of the colonial empires. Both the British and the French maintained long-term ties with their ex-colonies in these kind of, what Brits called Commonwealth. The French, I don't know if they have a name for it, but they're constantly talking about their special relationships, yada, yada, yada. And then, as we talked about at the end of the lecture 2 lectures ago, is you start to get these trading blocks. The EU arises directly as a counterweight. Well, first, as a solution to war. You can't have the EU without the world wars. So the EU is a direct result of the World War, and it's a direct result of international competition through creating an international bloc to counter the U.S. The Japanese trading area is a counter bloc. Now the Singapore Cooperation Organization, I guess it's SCO, not SEC, and so on. And then NAFTA is a counter organization. So these are all blocks that are being put together as a part of globalization by states into interstate, trans-state groups that can compete more readily. But that's a state move. It's not war. It's expansion without war, which is to be preferred. But it's still all about economic development and international competition. Okay, let's get to the American century. And there's 3 topics here: the Empire of Commerce, the Cold War era, and the neoliberal era. And the Empire of Commerce, when the United States closes it, we already had an empire, but it was called our state. We conquered a continent and called it the United States. So in a way, we didn't have to have an external empire because we already had one internally that involved conquest and destruction of previous peoples and so on. And Frederick Jackson Turner famously declares the closing of the frontier in 1893 in a very famous essay that everybody refers to in American history. And the U.S. did start to look abroad after that. That's when the U.S. starts to say, oh yeah, our frontier is closed. Let's think about external expansion. But how? Well, what the U.S. chose, it played around with colonies, with the Philippines. Maybe we'll take Cuba, Puerto Rico. But actually, the Philippine War was so horrid that there was a revulsion against it, and I think that stopped them in their tracks. In any case, the U.S. had always taken this more commercial route, which also has to do with our history as a more purely commercial society than in Europe. And so we chose more expansion through trade, investment, and so on. Very nice book by a geographer on this, Mona Domash's American Commodities in the Age of Empire. Then the U.S., by the time Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1912, he goes off and says, we'll help Europe. And he enters into the war against a lot of opposition, and then comes up with a League of Nations idea to try and get the Europeans to stop killing each other. It doesn't work. There's a very good book on all that by another geographer, Neil Smith, called American Empire. But it's about this geographer, Isaiah Bowman, and his relationship to Wilson and then to Franklin Roosevelt. Well, unfortunately, the hegemony failed in this world system. The U.S. is coming on. It's the biggest economy. It's starting to expand internationally. But at a key moment, Woodrow Wilson is defeated. The U.S. Senate votes against the League of Nations. We get what is called in American history isolationism. We do not, the League of Nations collapses basically without U.S. support. Doesn't mean anything. And on we go into the interwar period, which is a colossal calamity, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Europe then rearms and goes to war. There's no institution to avoid that. If it could have. Now, we don't know if it could have, but there was nothing there. And also, all the economies are collapsing because there's no trade agreements. They're all going autarkic and so on. World War II ends the European era. Well, I already said that. I don't really need to, except I guess I was going to say, already in 1944 and 43, U.S. planners already know we're going to win the war and are already planning post-war institutions. Bretton Woods agreement is in 1944, during the war. It's not over. D-Day hasn't happened. And they're already, or maybe it has in 40, what is it, D-Day 44 or 45? Huh? It's 44? Yeah, okay. So I think Bretton Woods is in the summer. So right after that, they know they're going to win. So they're already doing this. Yalta meetings with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Churchill was very annoyed with Roosevelt because basically Roosevelt ignored him and talked to Stalin about how they're going to carve up the world. So the U.S. is already planning. It's already taking, because Roosevelt felt that Wilson was right, and now was the time for the U.S. to step in. There's a very different, again, he's a very activist president, for better or worse. And you get American hegemony as the U.S. steps to the fore. Oh, I repeated myself here, sorry. We occupy Japan and Germany and reorganize their political structure and to some extent their economic structure. We put in the new international institutions of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods Group of Three, and so on, which is why their headquarters are in Washington and New York. And the U.S. totally dominates the world economy, as I said before. 2/3 of industrial production. We're the biggest exporter. Here's U.S. export. Next, exports are black, imports are checkered. Exports are exceeding imports most of this time. Here's another one. We have a positive trade balance through the post-war era. The dollar is king, and here it is. Here's the dollar against a basket of currencies. In the 1970s, when Nixon devalues the dollar, it suddenly falls very dramatically. It's still king, but it was unbelievably powerful. It was a great time to be an American tourist. So the post-war economic order, U.S. rebuilds trade. I talked to you about that. I gave you a chart on that already. Through the gap, it rebuilds. The U.S. exports capital. We hear a lot about the Marshall Plan into Europe, but there's other kinds of aid that will emerge subsequent to that. Massive military spending, which pumps into Europe and East Asia. Direct investment by our corporations. This is U.S. post-war direct investment as a share of world FDI, of foreign direct investment. I'm sorry, it's off the chart here. This is the post-war era. This is the neoliberal era. We used to be the dominant world investor. Now you have Indonesian corporations, Chinese corporations, Japanese. Everybody else is investing around the world, and we're just a small part of it. The World Bank was lending, and then we had financial stability, which I'll talk about more another time, with the dollar and fixed exchange rates. But, don't think post-war liberalism was very much pro-development. They really believed they were developing. And I know you learn in development courses that modernization theory sucks and export-led growth sucks and so on. But a lot of this was put forward. It was liberal. It wasn't radical. But it was often put forward thinking honestly that this would work. But it often did not. In fact, it was often the wrong thing to do. On the other hand, the U.S., this is an imperial presence. This is an imperial hegemon. This isn't just, the court, the Supreme Court of the world. This is the policeman of the world. And so there's an iron fist. We suppressed the Greek revolt. We suppressed revolts all over the world. We did business with dictators like Saddam Hussein. Oh, there he is shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld. I love that picture. We ignored international law and so on. We still do. We're not signers to the Geneva Accord. Well, no, we signed the Geneva Accords because that was right after the war. I believe. Did we finally sign it? But we've not signed the international agreement on mines, international agreement on war crimes. We don't recognize the sovereignty of the International Court of Human Rights and so on, because it might indict our guys and our soldiers, and we don't want that. Cold War era, moving through very quickly. The USSR and the US face off, these two separate economic systems. They're really different. They hate each other for all kinds of reasons. It breaks up. The World War II alliance breaks up, and then you get these events in 48, 49 that just drive a wedge between the two, and it's going to be out and out antagonism thereafter. The story you always hear in the U.S. is they started it. They were evil empire. That was the Reagan slogan, the evil empire, and that we were the free world. But the free world was only partly free. And that, which doesn't mean, by the way, I thought this was a good idea, or that the Soviets weren't thugs, very, very often. So but it's a rival, and it was very successful, and the U.S. was very afraid of the Soviet Union. It was afraid of the idea of communism spreading across Western Europe, spreading to the third world, to these newly liberated countries, and they did not want this to spread. So we created a military umbrella around the free world, the capitalist world, against the communist world. And you have to remember, the communist world with China had like half the world's population, or 40% of the world's population. India was neutral, so you take that out of there. So capitalism didn't even have half the world's people in it. And the front lines of this were NATO. The U.S. creates this NATO treaty organization to form a military curtain along the boundary between East and Western Europe, around China on the eastern front, or the western front, depending on how you look at it. We set up CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. We had agreements with Japan and Korea and so on, and we were generally defending that front. And we disarmed Europe, basically, and disarmed certainly the Germans, and we disarmed the Japanese, so that we were the only ones, really, we have a monopoly on the armaments. And we do to this day. And these became bulwarks of capitalism. They rebuilt the Marshall Plan, and all that rebuilding in West Germany was to get Germany back into the capitalist camp, West Germany. East Germany was lost to the Soviets. And they also sent in CIA teams and union guys from the U.S. who worked with the CIA to bust any kind of radical unions in Europe to make sure they didn't get too radical, that the European working class didn't vote for communism. On the Eastern Front, we rebuilt Japan, the Korean War, of course, against China, the split of South and North Korea, turning South Korea into another bulwark, Japan into a bulwark, tremendous spending through that war, which helped kickstart the Japanese miracle. And then, behind that overall barrier, we supported export-led development, particularly in East Asia. It wasn't just a trade policy, it was a Cold War policy to build up East Asian capitalism, especially. Europe was more, Germany selling to the rest of Europe. But we let them, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, export massively to us without complaining about it. We would be the consumer, and that was part of our Cold War strategy. And then, of course, we had massive third world containment, a very ugly story, which many of you have heard a zillion times. I won't repeat it today, but some of it is really ugly. The most well-known is Vietnam, but there are plenty of others, including CIA led overthrows of elected governments in Guatemala, Iran, Indonesia, and then finally Chile during this period. I think we'll end with that one under post-war. Once Cuba had a revolution, we went berserk after the failure of Bay of Pigs. So we ended up not only having the Alliance for Progress, and this is under Kennedy, another Democrat, having more trade and more aid, the good guys, the nice side, the smiling face. The not-so-smiling face is the School for the Americas, where we trained all the militaries of Latin America to be good at killing guerrillas. And that we really did, except we were so good at it that they all had military coups all over Latin America. And Latin America went into this very dark period for about 20 years of military dictatorships. Pinochet, the boys in Brazil, the Argentinian junta, and so on. It was pretty ugly. The problem with this whole strategy is, if you think modernization theory is bad, military intervention is the worst, because it actually just represses all the progressive forces in these countries, all the developmental forces, and keeps them in situations where they have extremely powerful oligarchies, extremely parasitic militaries. A place like Guatemala is classic, and they never get out of it. They were trying to get out of it in 1954 when we overthrew Ardenas, and today what do we got? We still have this horrific country with horrific repression that's never owned up to the 100,000 dead island native peoples. So it's not a very pretty picture. I recommend Walter Nugent's book, Habits of Empire, a very nice overview of American expansionism and our habits of that. I threw this in here. This is a great Life magazine. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, this is all about how the Bay of Pigs, the poor soldiers, how they were basically screwed by Kennedy, and for not giving enough support, and yada, yada, yada. We still hear the same thing. Support your boys. Support your soldiers, no matter what they're doing and where they are. It's a funny ideology, but it's an ideology of empire and putting a human face on it. At home, the Cold War military has a huge impact. It is the largest government sector, massive spending in military equipment, military bases, massive export. Still, our number one export is military arms. We're still the largest exporter of military equipment in the world. It's one thing we still do really well. Well, that was true of the USSR right till the moment they collapsed. They made really good weapons and rockets and so on. They couldn't make anything else very well. They're crappy consumer goods, and that's why it fell. But boy, those AK-47s, everybody still wants them. And, of course, the technology part of it. The geography of it's very interesting. After World War II, the military bases having to do with politics of the Democratic Party and the South, and then the Republicans in the South, that the South is getting more powerful again, more numerous, more electoral votes, and then the Southwest, where you have the electronics industry, California, getting a disproportionate amount of the spending on military equipment and the placement of military bases. So there's a great book by some former Berkeley faculty called The Rise of the Gun Belt, and the Sun Belt cannot be understood simply as moving to cheaper labor or the rise of the New South. It has to do very strongly with military spending. So it actually helps change the whole geography of America. With LA,